Okay, so thank you so much for coming to the fourth meeting of the Florida State University chapter of the International Association of Emergency Managers. We've had a great semester so far. We had former head of FEMA, Brock Long. We had Todd DeVoe, host of the IAEM Weekly podcast. At our last meeting, we had Laura Hart, FSU faculty member who teaches about unmanned aircraft systems. And this week, we have Christy Rojas, who is the Emergency Management Deputy Director with Volunteer Florida. Volunteer Florida is a state agency that handles a lot of volunteer efforts for disaster response and recovery from a wide variety of disasters like the pandemic quite recently, hurricanes obviously being in Florida. She also has worked in the past as an Unmet Needs Coordinator. She's an alumna of the Florida State University program. And it's so excellent to have her here with us tonight. We're going to have a great talk, some great discussion and Q&A. So thank you so much for being here, Christy, and I'll pass it to you now.
Thank you. I do have a presentation. Oh, it won't let me share it.
Oh, here, I'll edit the settings. Can you share now?
Perfect. Can you all see that?
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate you allowing me to come share with you. I'm going to share a lot about what Volunteer Florida does, but particularly volunteer efforts and donations and community involvement and how to best serve your community in a volunteer effort, and just a lot of really go through what Volunteer Florida does. And I'll share a little bit about myself as well. So I'm Christy Rojas. I have been an emergency manager for over 10 years now. I got my start with the American Red Cross. I didn't know I actually wanted to be an emergency manager. I am an FSU alum. I graduated with a degree in political science and anthropology. And then I had an opportunity to work with the American Red Cross, and I fell in love with it. I had grown up having exposure to the American Red Cross. I'm actually a Florida native. I went through Hurricane Andrew as a child, and I have this vivid memory of the American Red Cross serving coffee and food following Hurricane Andrew. And I knew I wanted to serve in some way, but I didn't know that this was a career opportunity. I was with the American Red Cross for close to 5 years. It was an incredible experience. And I didn't know what I was walking into. Like I said, I didn't go into it knowing that I wanted to be an emergency manager. But the unique thing about the American Red Cross is that it is 90% volunteer based. So if you are a staff member of the American Red Cross, you do a lot of things. So as a 23-year-old, I had the opportunity to do everything. I worked a shelter. I was boots on the ground in disasters. I was the public affairs officer. I spoke to the media, all kinds of crazy things that I don't know that I was prepared for, but it was a great opportunity. So in Tallahassee, I worked at the Capital Area Chapter in Tallahassee, and we served 8 counties, and there was only 5 staff members. So again, I got to do everything, including all of the 2 a.m. house fire phone calls that rolled in, seemed every night. And then I transitioned to the Florida Division of Emergency Management, and I had 2 different roles there. I actually started there as the Deputy Director of External Affairs. So I'm coming from the American Red Cross with this background of public affairs, and I had done a lot of public outreach, which I really did enjoy. But I got to the division, and it was such a 180. I loved being on the ground following disasters with the American Red Cross. I loved working with volunteers who were passionate, and it was hard to find my fitting when I was there with external affairs. And so then there was an opportunity in individual assistance under recovery to be this voluntary agency liaison. And I thought, oh, this is the perfect fit for me. And in that role, I worked closely with Volunteer Florida. And when they had an opportunity open up, I just knew that's where I really, really fit in. So we have this extensive background in volunteer engagement and management. And I started with Volunteer Florida as the CERT, C-E-R-T, Community Emergency Response Team Program Manager. And I've since transitioned to the Deputy Director, as was mentioned. But Volunteer Florida is, and I'm going to get more into what we do exactly, but I've been there for 4 years now. My very first day with Volunteer Florida was actually activation for Hurricane Hermine. So let's talk about just jumping right into your new role. I really was learning on the job, but I had turned in my badge on Friday from the Florida Division of Emergency Management. And then on Monday, I started deployed to State Emergency Operations Center. So it was like I had never left, but and it's been a whirlwind since, because if you remember, 2016 was Hurricane Hermine, and it just seems we've been activated kind of the whole time for the last 4 years. So it's been a whirlwind, but Volunteer Florida is great. So who is Volunteer Florida? We're the lead agency for volunteers and donations. We're a quasi-state agency. So we are a state agency. Our director is appointed by the governor, but we are also 501c3. We're the governor's 501c3. So we have a board and we have a foundation, and we are part of CNCS, which is the Corporation for National and Community Service, which every state has a federal, it's a federal program, but every state has a commission. So we're the commission. So we're 501c3, so we can accept donations. So that's why we're the lead agency for volunteers and donations. We work with the voluntary groups to respond to disasters. So I'm going to talk more about that as we go through this presentation. It's groups that you're familiar with, the American Red Cross, Salvation Army, and it's a lot of other groups that you might not have realized have a disaster component as well. We also manage those donated goods. So we get donated goods following a disaster, and we get cash. And I'm going to talk about the best and most efficient ways to support following a disaster, and what we do with goods and money when we get them in. I'm going to talk a lot about VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. We actually, Volunteer Florida, we sit on the board of the Florida VOAD. We're a non-voting member. And it's that group of voluntary organizations that come together to work with local emergency management and the coordinated effort. We're going to talk a lot more about VOAD as we go on. And then we collect the data on voluntary agencies statewide. We do it for a number of reasons. Volunteers are truly the heart and soul of disaster recovery. So it's a great media story. It's a great feel good. Volunteers do amazing things, but volunteer hours have actually a monetary value. In Florida, 1 hour of service is worth $24.93 an hour. And so when it comes to meeting that cost share after a federally declared disaster, if we've kept track of those voluntary hours, we can help communities pay that cost share back. And we have a great example of Joplin following the tornadoes. They did such a fabulous job calculating all of their volunteer hours and all of their donated resources. They didn't have to pay the federal government any cost share. They met it all with donated resources. And then lastly, we have the CERT program. So it's confusing in Florida because we have CERT with an S and CERT with a C, but that's the Community Emergency Response Teams. And I hope you're familiar with CERT. And if you're not, it is a great program. It is a volunteer program. It is a nationwide federal program that it is average people are trained in disaster response. And the whole purpose is that you're the first responders before the first responders arrive. So you can take care of your family, your neighbors, and allow the first responders to take care of those critical needs following a disaster. We've really developed and ramped up the program in Florida, and our CERT teams have done amazing things to include deploying to hurricanes outside of their area, which is not a typical component of CERT, but our CERT teams are great in Florida. Unfortunately, if you're in Tallahassee, Leon County does not have a CERT program, but if you're elsewhere, it is a great opportunity to get involved in emergency management. So you guys are familiar with the state level emergency management. So we have the CERT, S-E-R-T team, and it's made up of, partner agencies, voluntary agencies, private sector, and a bunch of state agencies. So in Florida, we have 18 emergency support functions. Our counties all look different how they structure those, but they're typically similar. So Florida is unique, and you may know this, but Florida is unique in that all 67 of our counties actually have an emergency operations center in each county. And they're all required actually to have a lead for volunteers and donations. So theoretically, every single county has someone who has my position at the local county level. So we're ESF 15, Emergency Support Function 15, volunteers and donations. So Volunteer Florida is that lead agency. We don't do it by ourselves. Not only do we work together with a number of other state agencies or ESFs, we work with our VOAD partners, and we work with a lot of the national service members, which is AmeriCorps. And we work with those faith-based and community organizations. You'd be surprised to find that every denomination has a disaster component in their denomination, and they work with us to service the community following disasters. So what does ESF 15 do? So I mentioned that we work very closely with other state agencies or other ESFs. We work very closely with ESF 6, which is mass care, and they take on the feeding and the sheltering, but that's done with voluntary agencies. So we work very closely with them. But ESF 15's responsibilities are the volunteer and donation hotline. And I'll talk about some of our triggers on when we decide to turn on the hotline and what it is. We have a physical space across the street from State Emergency Operations Center, and we're co-located with the state. It's called the Florida Emergency Information Line. We're co-located with them, and it's a 1-800 number for the general public to call in with volunteer or donations, volunteer opportunities or donations that they may have. We live in 2020. Here we are doing a Zoom presentation. So obviously technology is our friend now. We did have a volunteer donation hotline for Irma, but we found for Michael that technology, we don't really need that physical hotline anymore. We directed everyone to our website, and we had 2 buttons on there that said volunteer or donate. And we didn't have a need for a donations hotline, which was great because we can use volunteers for other things. But again, we have technology on our side, so our hotline is actually always on. It's not actually activated until the governor activates it, but if you picked up the phone right now and you called, it's 1-800-FLORIDA-HELP-1. It rings our office, and when our office feels that there's an overwhelming amount of calls, that's what triggers us to open our call center, and we depend on volunteers for that. So we also coordinate that voluntary agency response, right? I mentioned that previously. I feel like we're Volunteer Florida, it makes sense. We actually have no volunteers of our own. We're not a direct service agency. So we just work with those other voluntary agencies, and we all make sure we have a coordinated effort so we can best meet the needs of survivors, so we're not duplicating efforts. And we really want to coordinate with the local emergency managers. We just don't want volunteers in a community without that coordinated effort. We manage spontaneous volunteers, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about what spontaneous volunteers are and how we manage them. Donated goods, you'll take away one thing from this presentation, and it's that cash is best, but even though we would, in an ideal world, we'd get no donated goods, we do, and so we need to manage those. So how are we going to do that? We work with partners who are great at warehouse management, and they will take and collect all of those items and redistribute it to the community. So I actually have a warehouse open right now for Hurricane Sally in the Panhandle, and our partner is the Adventist. They are great at warehouse management, and they come in and they take on that role, and we call it a multi-agency warehouse. We share it with all of our partners. Our impacted counties can pull from the items that are in the warehouse, and so they take on those collected items and they inventory it, and so that we can redistribute it in an efficient manner, because donated goods are actually often called the second disaster, because it can be such a disaster when unsolicited goods come into an area. And the same with undesignated cash. What do you do with undesignated cash? How do you manage that? So that's something that we take on as well. And then Florida is unique. We have something called the Florida Disaster Fund. It falls under Volunteer Florida, so it falls under our foundation. So we have a board and a foundation. It falls under our foundation. It was created in 2004 after all of the storms hit Florida in 2004. The governor at the time decided to create this private fund, because remember, we're a nonprofit, so we can collect donations. So he created this private fund, and we collect these donations, and then we administer them out in the form of grants to our partners that are boots on the ground. So we give out we actually give out several rounds of grants, but we will give out grants immediately while we're still in the Emergency Operations Center. If we have funds in there, we'll give it out to our partners who are boots on the ground right then and there. And then we save a lot of that cash for long-term recovery. And I'll talk about that as we go on. But to recover from disasters, it can take many, many years. Hurricane Andrew, for example, took 19 years for us to close out. So having those funds available for that long-term recovery is important, and that's something that the Florida Disaster Fund allows us to do. So I've talked about VOAD, and I've talked about Florida VOAD, but Florida VOAD, there's also the national VOAD, and it's made up of, and remember that's the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. So it's made up of faith-based non-governmental organizations, but there's also actually private sector foundations that are part of this as well. So all of the organizations that are part of the VOAD, they have this, this core mission of disaster response, and they do have a national presence. But by national presence, it doesn't mean that every single organization necessarily has an office in every single state. My example is a fabulous organization we work with called Tool Bank. They're part of our national VOAD, and they come in with the support of UPS Foundation, and they bring tools into a community that has just had a disaster, and they lend them out library style to the nonprofits that are working in the communities. So they don't have an office here in Florida, but they've shown up after every disaster that we've had. So they have that national presence. And then again, we work together in that coordinated effort so that we make sure we're all not duplicating services. We are working with local emergency managers. We're working with other nonprofits. And it is a very coordinated effort. So National VOAD is a partner, it's the partner coordinating network, right? So in my next slide, I'll talk about the 4 C's of National VOAD. But as you can see, it's all of these groups working together. And one of the most important things for being part of VOAD, both national and Florida VOAD, is we really want to make sure that as voluntary organizations, we're sitting at the table with emergency managers so that we're speaking the same language, that we're responding in the ways that their community needs. Because you guys know this, all disasters start and end locally. So we want to make sure that we are having those conversations. So here are a few of our partners. There are hundreds of partners, especially at the national level. In Florida, our VOAD has about 60 members and probably on average 100 participants on our phone calls and in our coordinated efforts. But we have the 4 C's. That's what we work through in VOAD. It's cooperation, communication, coordination, and collaboration. So our goal is to all work together, and we have some great stories of different groups all supporting each other for that one common goal at the end of the day. No one's out there competing. We all have the same goal to rebuild a community following a disaster. And then in Florida, we have our Florida VOAD. And just like many things in emergency management, Florida VOAD has their gray sky role and their blue sky role. And actually, so I mentioned earlier that Volunteer Florida has a non-voting seat on the board of the Florida VOAD. And then when we actually are in gray sky times, Volunteer Florida assumes the administrative roles of the Florida VOAD, because again, the VOAD is made up of our voluntary agencies, and so they're going to be responding to that disaster. So we'll take on those administrative roles of that reporting and those call management. And then we will host daily phone calls during the height of a disaster. And then as it kind of slows down, we will go into more, right now we're still having weekly calls for Hurricane Sally. And then eventually we just go into our long-term recovery collaboration calls in gray sky. In blue sky, it's about our networking. It's about training and exercises. And this is the other thing I hope you take away from this, is that all of emergency management is about relationships. And that's really what we do in our blue sky with VOAD, is build those relationships so that we can collaborate and work together in the gray sky. It just makes a difference when you are able to sit down at the table and you have this relationship before the disaster. So is Florida hurricane prone? I've had the opportunity to travel to other states, and people will always say, oh, Florida is the hurricane state. And yes, we are. Look at this, the last 100 years, all the tracks across Florida. We are hurricane prone. We know this. We know how to prepare for hurricanes. But the truth is, we have to have that all hazard approach in Florida, right? Everywhere but Florida. And the thing about this slide is, I think we've experienced a lot of these this year. Earlier this year, I actually deployed to a wildfire. We obviously have had hurricanes, and I hope you're keeping an eye on the tropics, because we still actually actually have a full month of hurricane season left, and there's something out there that we'll see what it does next week. And then of course, 2020, we were experiencing a pandemic. So all hazards, anything can happen at any time, and pre-planned events as well. We're actually activating the state emergency operation level to a moderated level 2 tomorrow for the elections. We activate for Super Bowl or any other big events that we know we're going to have in the state of Florida. So it's not only hazards, it could be for pre-planned events as well. But the thing is that in a hazard, especially, we know certain things are going to be needed, right? Water, food, all of those examples on the last slide, water, food, shelter, and financial assistance are typically needed in a hazard. And a lot of those come in the form of volunteers and donations. So why do people volunteer in a disaster? There's a number of reasons. It's personal, right? But for some people, it's that sincere wish to help. It may be motivated by that religion or that faith-based background. You might want to pay it forward. Sometimes you were a disaster survivor yourself, and so you want to give back to your community what you received. Sometimes it's your own community and you just feel this need to help. You might have some skills that you feel like are going to be beneficial to the disaster, to volunteering. And sometimes really it can be driven by the desire to fit in, and you want to post a cool hashtag on social media. So there's a number of reasons why you might volunteer, but it's personal, and we do see a lot of volunteers in the state of Florida. We have two categories. So I mentioned in a slide back, I said something about spontaneous volunteers. We have two categories. We call them affiliated or spontaneous volunteers. Some people call them event-based volunteers or unaffiliated volunteers. So affiliated volunteers, they come attached to a relief agency. So you see here the AmeriCorps logo, and I failed to mention in my first slide about Volunteer Florida, we actually are the agency. Our primary function of Volunteer Florida is we administer the AmeriCorps program throughout the state of Florida. So AmeriCorps are great. We actually have some that arrived today to help us with Hurricane Sally, and we're very excited to have them here. But it can be any affiliated, it can be any kind of group. It can be the American Red Cross, Salvation Army, Southern Baptist, someone that's attached to a relief agency. And what's great about them is that they have specialized skills. Their volunteers come trained and certified. And the biggest thing is they come with their own liability and logistics. Spontaneous volunteers often want to come, and they come with great enthusiasm, and we'll talk about them in a second, but they don't come with that liability, and they don't come with those logistics. Where are they going to sleep? How are they going to shower? Who's going to, what are they going to do? Have they coordinate with emergency management? So that's why affiliated volunteers are great. Spontaneous volunteers, they are great as well. And oftentimes an affiliated volunteer began as a spontaneous volunteer. There was a big event, they want to help, they show up, and then they have a great experience and they continue to volunteer with that organization. The great thing about spontaneous volunteers is a lot of times they're that timely help. A big event's happened and these volunteers show up and they want to help. They're not attached to an organization. If they are, sometimes it'll be maybe a school group that wants to come and volunteer together, or a neighborhood that wants to come together, but they're not attached to a disaster organization. They can be highly skilled. We could see an arborist group that wants to come and help us remove trees off of roofs. So they're a skilled group, but they're not an affiliated organization. A lot of times they're from that impacted area, but in a large scale disaster, we also see them come from out of town as well. They're typically, again, if they're coming to serve, they're typically passionate about it. And so they're that timely help. So what do we do with spontaneous volunteers? Because again, it's not coming coordinated effort. We help communities in our Blue Sky roles. We do this training called VRC, or Volunteer Reception Centers. And it is a place that as spontaneous volunteers come into the community, we can direct them to a physical brick and mortar building where they can find out what the need is in that community. And then it's a little more coordinated, and they can go and support, they can get on the job training. They're usually being placed with an affiliated group so that liability is covered. And so we'll try to direct spontaneous volunteers to those volunteer reception centers or VRCs. So why do people donate? Some of it's the same as why they volunteer, right? There's that sincere desire to help. It may be religious or faith-based. They were a survivor in the past who received some kind of either financial aid or gift of donated goods, and now they want to pay it forward. They want to be part of the cause. I said that, you know, social media especially, you really want to be part of the cause. Typically, they're responding to a media report. You've seen the disaster on the news cycle. You want to support, so you do something about it. And that's tricky too, because as soon as a disaster is out of the media cycle, we really lose volunteers and donations. And sometimes you just want to clean out your closet, which I should have included in this presentation. During Hurricane Irma, we received a box full of prom dresses, which have no benefit to us following a disaster. It was humorous and it gave us some comic relief at the State Emergency Operations Center, but we get cleaned out closets all the time and then we have to dispose of those items. I will tell you several times we've gotten new products that people want to introduce to the market that are great in a disaster. And so those organizations will call us up and they'll donate those to us as well. So there's a number of reasons why people donate. So some helpful hints for donors and volunteers is that cash is completely the best donation you can ever give. And when you call our office and you tell us you want to donate, we'll tell you cash is best. And we'll direct you to, we won't tell you what organization to give to. We'll actually direct you to the National VOAD website and we'll tell you to pick one of those voluntary organizations. They're vetted, they're reputable, they're legitimate organizations who are boots on the ground. So pick whatever you're passionate about. If it's animals, there's going to be an organization that is doing something to serve animals. If it's the American Red Cross, I mean, there's a number of organizations you can give to. Confirm the need before you volunteer or donate. Don't just decide to host a food drive. Confirm with the food bank that that's the need. And then if they say yes, make sure it's packed well, labeled clearly, clean, don't send dirty things, and plan your own transportation. How are you going to get these items there? Because in a disaster especially, these agencies don't have time to pick up your donations. We will tell you if you call our office to donate miscellaneous goods to the local charities. The thrift stores, and I'll tell you a few reasons why. They are our partners, so the Salvation Army and Goodwill, they actually give out vouchers to disaster survivors following an impacted, if there's disaster survivor. So they can sort those, and actually you can't just dispose of clothing that's not useful. So you have to, there's certain machinery that's required, there's certain procedures that are required. And so if we're giving to Salvation Army and Goodwill, who every day does this, they have those processes in place. The Adventists that have a warehouse right now in the Panhandle for Hurricane Sally, they don't have those processes in place. So giving to those local thrift stores. Also, when you've lost everything, you may need everything, but just being handed old t-shirts really doesn't do a lot for your morale after you've just lost everything. Getting to go to the thrift store and picking out clothing that is your style and your size and something that you will feel comfortable in really helps a disaster survivor. Same with food banks. They have the processes in place to already distribute those foods and sort those foods, and they're working with us as well. They'll always see an increased need following a disaster, so they need to restock for their everyday folks that they regularly work with. And then I've already mentioned to VOAD members, whatever you do, do not give to the disaster site. Do not take donations to a disaster site. I encourage you after this to Google the second disaster with donations. It is a complete disaster within a disaster when unsolicited donated goods arrive to a disaster site. And then again, for volunteers, be an affiliated volunteer. So Volunteer Florida, I told you about the 4 C's that National VOAD has. Volunteer Florida, we have the 3 C's. Cash, confirm, connect. So cash is best, confirm the need always, and connect with the organization before you do anything. So as I said, cash is preferred. Why? It helps those voluntary agencies meet the precise need. It helps rebuild the local economy. So if a disaster has just hit, for example, Hurricane Sally hit the Panhandle, we need to re-stimulate the economy. Even if it's only box stores that are reopening, that employs the local community. So reopening the local community helps the devastated area rebuild faster. Cash is timely. We don't have to figure out transportation. We don't have to figure out how or where to open a warehouse. You mentioned I have a warehouse for Hurricane Sally right now. It took me a month to open it. Cash could be there immediately. And then again, we have procedures to distribute. Remember I told you we have the Florida Disaster Fund. We have standard accounting procedures for cash. We can inventory it better. It's easier to store. And then again, as we are trying to rebuild communities, the cash supports those long-term recovery committees. And so who should you donate to? I've already shared that. It should definitely be voluntary organizations, national VOAD, right? We know those are legitimate, vetted organizations. We will tell you to avoid GoFundMes or pop-up donation sites. GoFundMes actually take a percentage of donated money, and there's no oversight in them. So whoever starts that GoFundMe, all of that cash is theoretically theirs. And then disaster relief funds. So I shared that Florida has the Florida Disaster Fund, and actually a number of states have taken our idea of the disaster fund and they have one that looks very similar to ours. So this is a great little illustration I love to share about disaster donations. So it's a great idea to do a canned food drive as we're going into the holiday season, right? We'll definitely see a lot of canned food drives. So spinach costs about 89 cents on average. So you're gonna collect cans. So you buy an 89-cent can of spinach, you pack it up and you ship it. And now it gets to the disaster site and we have to find volunteers who can unload this truck of miscellaneous stuff that's all come in. We have to sort it, make sure it's not dented, expired. Again, remember I told you I got prom dresses, so who knows what else I'm gonna get. Now we need more volunteers to resort it, to redistribute it. And then this 89-cent can of spinach has cost us $10. If you had donated 89 cents through our network with the food banks, we could have bought multiple cans of spinach. Or if you donated $10 because you shipped it on your own, we could have bought so much other necessary things. So again, why should you give to voluntary organizations versus local governments is voluntary organizations do this every day. I've already shared that with you. Goodwill, Salvation Army, they have those processes in place. They do it every day. They know how to manage the funds. They're accustomed to giving out grants, and they have that accountability. And they know the IRS processes and donor intent and how to report it. And government may not. And I mentioned cash is critical for that long-term recovery. The government leaves pretty quickly after a disaster. Voluntary agencies stay for the long haul. So it helps support that long-term recovery. The Mennonites are a great example of a group that they give 2-year commitments following a disaster that they're going to stay in a community for 2 years to help rebuild. So having funds for long-term for them to rebuild homes, we can do that with cash. And who can take those funds? We encourage United Ways are great as long-term recovery committees stand up, or another fiscal agent that already has those processes in place. And then again, we've talked about it, cash can be directed to nonprofits, and it just helps with that long-term recovery efforts. So before a disaster, what can you do, right? So you can't help others if you don't help yourself first. So don't show up as a volunteer, affiliate with a national VOAD organization, get disaster training. CERT, community emergency response teams, are great if you live in an area that has that. So like I said, unfortunately, Leon County doesn't. But most important, prepare your family and your pets. Every family looks unique, but don't forget your pets. And having that plan in place, remember, you can't help others if you don't help yourself first. So having yourself prepared allows you to serve your community following a disaster. We have a great new platform at Volunteer Florida. It is called Volunteer Connect, and it's actually something we use in both Blue Sky and Gray Sky, and it's the official Florida platform for volunteer. So agencies can, it's kind of a virtual volunteer reception center all year long without disaster. So agencies can go on and put their volunteer opportunities, and then individuals can go and seek opportunities. And following a disaster, you can go and sign up and say, I want to support. How can I support? What are the opportunities available? So Volunteer Connect is great. It's like I said, we've had it for a year. We unveiled it right before Hurricane Dorian last year. It can schedule volunteers. It can track those volunteer signups. It's just a great resource to really help bring together those volunteers so we can have that coordinated response. And so that's it. That ends my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. I'm passionate about volunteers. I hope you saw that. Please, and I do have contact information. You guys are always available to contact me. But yes, and if anyone has any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Hi, yes. If you had to say is the most logistically complicated part of your job, like if you had to name one thing, what do you think that thing would be? And how do you overcome that?
The most logistically complicated. I mean, we're coordinating hundreds of groups, right? So that can be logistically complicated. And I think especially in a disaster, things are moving so fast. So the state will call and tell us, we need, for example, this just happened with Sally, we need additional feeding partners. And by the time we coordinate and get everyone set up, the need has shifted and it's something else. So sometimes that's difficult. Everything's moving so fast, but it goes back to relationships. I really think like you have those relationships established before the disaster, where we all are working together regularly and we can have those candid conversations. Does that answer your question?
It did, thank you.
Well, I'll ask a question. What would you say have been a few of the disasters over the course of your career so far that have been the most straining, the most stressful on yourself, on Volunteer Florida, on people you work with?
So COVID has been interesting because it's just been a different type of disaster. So that's stressful in a different way. Hurricane Irma impacted almost the entire state. 49 of 67 counties were declared. So that was very long. I mean, we're still doing things for Hurricane Irma, so that was very long. And my director at the time, he and I were deployed away from home for 6 months. But my role was very difficult as well because it hit the panhandle that isn't resource rich. And so it presented a different number of different challenges. In the panhandle, they all share, I mentioned when I worked for the Red Cross, we service 8 counties. And so that's really common in the panhandle. So you don't have your own American Red Cross, you don't have your own United Way. So you're already sharing those resources and now you need additional resources. So they all had their different challenges. But I'd say those 3, I mean, really have been, Irma was hard because it was so long and so big and we were away for so long.
Okay, wow. Well, another question I'd like to ask is, would you say that you growing up and your upbringing, really enjoyed volunteering and you were very altruistic, and so you kind of ultimately grew up to do this sort of thing, like you envisioned yourself doing this, or did you discover a passion for emergency management and this sort of work later, like around your college years?
Right. So my degree is in political science and anthropology. I thought I wanted to go to law school and go into politics. I knew I had a heart for passion. I had volunteered my entire life. While I was in college, I was leading a Girl Scout troop. So volunteering service was important to me. but no, it was almost accidental. I knew once I decided I didn't want to go to law school, I wanted to work for a nonprofit because I wanted to serve the community every day. And it was really at the American Red Cross that I was like, this is exactly what I wanted to do, but I didn't realize it. I didn't know, but it is exactly what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand the political science thing. I think a lot of people major in that who they like politics, they find it interesting, they're passionate, they have lots of political viewpoints and opinions, but then it's like, well, wait a minute, how do I actually materialize this into a job, into a career? And obviously there's a bunch of ways you can do that. But yeah, I mean, I've kind of had that journey myself of being poli-sci as well as criminology, and the certificate program here offered here at FSU was such a blessing. I mean, it was such a gateway for me because it's just such an intriguing and important and vital field, and it's a great way to do something practical. You know, more than just being interested in politics, which is kind of everybody, but not even being political, but just being useful for society. This is such a great way to do that in emergency management.
So I will add though that regardless of your degree, there is a place for everyone in emergency management, right? So I did have a degree in political science, and actually when I was with the American Red Cross and when I first joined the Florida Division of Emergency Management, I was a registered lobbyist at both places. So I did get to use my poli-sci degree a little bit. But if you're a finance major, I mean, disasters aren't free. They cost a lot of money. There's a place for you there. There's a place for everything in emergency management. And they're usually pretty niche, but there's a place for everywhere. So that is something to remember.
Okay. And well, does anyone else have any questions? Because I have one more, but I don't want to hog it. Anyone else have any questions at all? Don't be shy.
Yep, I got one. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it. Yep.
Okay. I just did a paper for one of my classes, and FEMA just released a new rule a couple weeks ago, starting November 1st. Any recovery efforts after that point will be built to the highest zoning and building codes. If not, FEMA is not going to be around to finance anything. What do you think that's going to affect?
So this is the first time hearing about that. So that's interesting. We've seen 2020. Today I was on a call with a colleague. 2020 has been the costliest disaster year between every single state responding to COVID, and then we tied the record for hurricanes with this last named storm. And again, we still have a whole month of hurricane season left. So we need FEMA to be around. So they have to get creative, I guess. But I don't know. I'm not familiar with it, but I do have to remind you that volunteers and donations both have monetary value, so that can help us fund to some level that cost share to help support disaster recovery.
Okay, I'll go back on my assignment, and I'm gonna pull it up and post the FEMA notice. So
yeah, I'm very interested.
Thanks.
Contact information is there. I'm very serious, guys. You guys are always welcome to reach out to me. And that's a genuine, serious.
Yeah, we're going to email out, your email, phone number. I mean, LinkedIn page. I mean, if you don't mind that being emailed out, we're going to email it to our people if they want to get in touch with you.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, the question I did have, you mentioned earlier about avoiding duplication of services or duplication of benefits, right? Which I know avoiding duplication benefits is so vital to like FEMA public assistance, for example. So it's really important in that recovery process. Do you ever deal with people, I mean, how do I word this properly? I mean, do you deal with people trying to, commit some kind of white collar crime or some kind of fraud, some kind of people being vultures, with these volunteer efforts and with these relief efforts? Or do you feel like people are usually pretty like in good character about it, considering the nature of the situation?
No, absolutely we do. So in fact, in Hurricane Sally, we had a situation where we got a call about this family, and Sally was smaller, so it's easier to manage at that level. And it dinged on the Red Cross's service that these people had been requesting these services, and then they were trying to go to a different county and request different services. And so we do work. Red Cross actually owns. They created it's called CAN, it's Coordinated Assistance Network, and nonprofits can all play inside there so that we can make sure we're not duplicating services. And so that's part of the reason that the long-term recovery committees are important following a disaster. That is, and I didn't really touch on it, but long-term recovery committees stand up following a disaster, and it's made up of, again, disasters are local, right? So it's made up of those local nonprofits, it's made up of federal and state partners, and just concerned community folks who want to see their community rebuild. And they'll use CAN, or they'll use another service to make sure that they're not duplicating those benefits. And FEMA is very strict about that as well. So yes, we do see it, unfortunately. And we see a lot of fraud after disasters. Unfortunately, people take advantage of people. It's super important that in a disaster, our agencies do wear their logos so that people know that they are legitimate. And again, why we tell you to donate to the National VOAD members, because we know they're vetted, legitimate partners.
Right. No, vetting is so important. It's so important. By the way, I saw that Cam posted in the chat that FEMA thing he was talking about. For anyone who wants to scoop that up, and I'm going to save the chat as a document for anyone who wants it later, wants to email me, or extend it to Christy or whoever. Well, would anyone have any other questions for Christy?
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate you letting me to come and share. And again, I'm very serious. Please reach out to me. I'd love to either further discuss anything, or if you think of questions later, I'd love to answer them.
Yeah, I definitely encourage you guys to reach out to Christy. Yeah, she's a bevy of experience and wisdom in this part of emergency management. She can tell you all about that, tell you a lot about Volunteer Florida. They got some great opportunities there for helping out even at the internship level. I was lucky enough to help out with that this past summer, and it was very rewarding, and it was a great feeling to help out with some of those efforts. And definitely encourage you guys to look into Volunteer Florida and reach out to Christy. So yeah, round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I am going to give some quick announcements for the end of our meeting. Like I said, I'm not on my personal laptop. It's having some issues. So we're going to kind of ad-lib it a little bit. Our public information officer, Ashlyn, has posted, thank you, Ashlyn. She's posted many of our social media links in the chat. And we're also going to email these out later. So, you guys will be able to keep it in email, in your inbox. Yeah, don't forget the sign-in sheet that Lucian posted. And big news, we have the IAEM annual conference in 2 weeks. It's going to be virtual. They've got a great online platform they've set up for it this year. They're going to have the current FEMA administrator, Peter Gaynor, speaking there, as well as many other big names in the field. You're going to hear a lot about lots of innovations. There's going to be a lot of networking opportunities. And I am going to share my screen, and we're going to watch a quick trailer for it. They did a really good job of setting up a platform for it this year. Let me quickly go to the website. Bear with me here. Thank you for your patience. Here it is.
IAEM is excited.
By the way, are you guys able to hear that on your end? Good. Okay, good.
IAEM is excited to invite you to the 2020 IAEM Reimagine Virtual Conference and EMEX exhibit this November. Our virtual event will bring you a brand new way of experiencing the conference you already know. Experience a full 3-day conference agenda from keynote addresses to breakout sessions covering the latest information to share in emergency management. Program sessions will be live and include interactive Q&A with our featured speakers. There will be plenty of opportunity for networking with colleagues and friends from across the country. Connect with fellow attendees one-on-one in virtual conference rooms. Visit the EMEX Expo Hall to connect with exhibitors and learn about the latest innovations in our industry. In each booth, you'll find informational resources and have the opportunity to meet with booth staff live or schedule a meeting for later. Our virtual conference will have interactive showcases to highlight our posters, IAEM awards, and new products. Don't miss out on this year's IAEM Reimagine Virtual Conference and EMEX exhibit. Visit our event website to register now. We can't wait to see you there.
Yeah, and so let me see, pull it back up, pull up the Zoom chat where